All right, let me start by asking you a question this morning. How many of you believe God wants you to thrive in 2015? If you believe that, let me see your hands this morning, all right? Now, I know some of you are watching this on video. I got my spies. They can see if you're raising your hands. I just want to know. You see, I trust you are coming to believe that His Word is true, that He has said to us it is His desire that our lives be good and filled with the fruit of what He wants to do in you. He's doing that already, and He has great plans for your life in 2015. And so our series is called Thrive. So far, we've covered two of those letters. The T in Thrive stood for trust. If we're going to thrive, we are going to have to put our confidence in God and trust His Word as the secure foundation of our lives. And so to thrive, we begin by trusting. The H stood for heal. You may remember just last week, we said that we all will face times of pruning in our lives, times of difficulties, physical difficulties, financial, emotional, relational difficulties. And we say, God, what are you up to? But remember, just as the song said a moment ago, He's for us, not against us. And His purpose in all of that is to heal, to bring us out of the pruning season ultimately into that much more of a productive season. If you believe that's true, say amen. And so the H in Thrive is for heal. Now, before we get to the R, you see it on the screen, but before we begin to talk about the R, I just want to mention to you that if you weren't able to beat either of those sermons, our sermons are always available on our website, and beginning this weekend, they will now be available also in video format. You'll be able to go to our website. It'll link you to our YouTube channel, and you can watch the sermon in video format. If you want to see if I'm as good looking on video as I am in person, check it out on our YouTube channel. This morning, we want to talk about risk. Say that word with me, risk. You see, if we're going to thrive, there comes a point in life where we have to be willing to step out with God. I want you to know that we live in an age that calls for bravery. We do not live in an age that will be won by those who are cowards. In fact, the Bible says in the book of Hebrews that God's children are not the sort who shrink back and are destroyed, but rather we are those who press forward into victory. I love the story that was just read, don't you? Man, I read that story, I get to the end, I just want to kind of fist pump. I want to go, yeah! I like stories like that. And listen, that story resonates with me, not because I can climb the side of a sheer cliff with just my hands and feet. That story does not resonate with me because I'm good with a sword. The story resonates with me because it tells me what happens when God's people dare to step out in faith and to trust Him and to take a risk and to see what He might do. Henry David Thoreau was an American philosopher almost 2 centuries ago, but what he said still rings true today. He said, most of us live lives of quiet desperation and go to the grave with our song still within us. I think of that term, quiet desperation. It reminds me of a character from a movie I watched years ago. His name is Mr. Incredible. Look on the screen. You remember this guy? Come on, did you ever see this movie? If not, you didn't have kids, but you ought to see it. Mr. Incredible is Bob Parr. But Bob Parr has been put into the superhero relocation program. The reason is because the higher-ups have realized there's too much collateral damage when superheroes do their work. And they're getting bankrupt with lawsuits. Don't lawyers just make everything better in this world? And so they say superheroes can't do their thing anymore. So Bob Parr and his family get shelved. They get put into a place where no longer can they be used. And so now he sits in a cubicle that's barely larger than him. And he sits and he wishes in quiet desperation for the glory days. You see, he's just not satisfied living a life that's full of bowling nights and, honey, don't forget to take out the trash tonight. And he longs once again to be able to risk. And so he sits and listens to police scanners. Sometimes Christians have mistakenly believed that God's prime directive to us is to make sure that now that we're saved, we don't do anything wrong. But I say to you rather that God's prime directive to us is that he has called us here for this time and this day to go do some things right, to take some risks, to step out and say, God, what are you doing and how can we join you in it? To become like Jonathan and his armor bearer and say, okay, God, what do you want us to do? Because you need to understand, if we are going to thrive this year, the first thing we have to do is we have to do something. We have to do something. Saul is the king of Israel at this time. But in this story, once again, as it seems is always the case, he's just sitting on the sidelines. It says in the text that Saul and his 600 men are sitting under a pomegranate tree. Now you might say, and it would be true, that Saul could give many reasons for why he's sitting on the sidelines. The circumstances are dire. As was read to you, Saul only has 600 men. The Philistines are mighty. Their boot is on the neck of the Israelite people. They have 3,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, warriors as numerous as the sand of the sea. An earlier chapter told us that they had come and had rid Israel of all of its blacksmiths. And so Israel didn't even have weapons. All they had were slingshots. There were 2 swords in the whole camp. Saul had one. Jonathan, his son, had the other. That was all they had for hand-to-hand combat weapons. And the circumstances are dire. And Saul is sitting on the sidelines. You know, just a chapter earlier, there was an important victory that needed to take place. An entire garrison needed to be stormed and overrun. And you know what? The text says that Jonathan is the one who did it. And Saul watched, and when he saw that the victory was going to take place, Saul rode in, took all the credit. Later, just a couple chapters after this story, we will read about how Saul sits on the sideline and quakes in fear because there's a giant in the land named Goliath. Who's it going to take to slay Goliath, church? Come on, tell me. It's going to take a boy named David while Saul sits on the sidelines. Can I say to you, I don't want to live my life sitting on the sidelines. I'm tired of churches and Christians who sit on the sidelines saying, well, you know what? It's too difficult in this world to make a difference for God. Jesus didn't die on a cross so that the church would sit on the sidelines. He died on the cross and gave his life so that we would give ours. And I love what Jonathan says here. He says, you know what? This is going to have to be a faith endeavor. Look at the verse. He says, perhaps the Lord will help us. In other words, let's step out. Let's do something. And let's just see what God will do. Because he can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few. Every endeavor of the Christian life should be a faith endeavor. We step out in faith. While Saul is sitting on the sidelines, Jonathan is listening to police scanners. And he's going into action. Look, there are always excuses, reasons that we give. Many times they seem very legitimate. Reasons we'll give to say, you know what, we can't do this. Jonathan could have said, you know what, there's only two of us. There's just me and you, my armor bearer. What difference can we really make? Jonathan could have said strategically, our circumstance isn't that great. If you understand the picture here, what's happening is Saul and his men are up on top of one cliff, and the Philistines are over on the other cliff. But the Philistines have all the power and all the position, and they have complete control also of the passageway of Michmash that runs between them. It's all run by the Philistines. And Jonathan could have said, you know what? This just isn't going to work. This isn't a good time. He could have said the odds are against us. There's no way to do it. He could have said, you know what? They have great weapons. We have just one sword. But rather he says, you know what? I think God might just be stirring my heart. Perhaps it's time for me to do something. What is God stirring your heart to do today? Where is he calling you out and asking you to take a risk and to be brave? Have you sat quietly and said nothing while things that are wrong go on in your world? And it's time for you to find your voice and to say something? Have you knuckled under time and time and time again? You've wanted to invite that person to church. You've wanted to share the love of Jesus, but you just get so nervous in this day and age. But it's time to be brave and to take a risk and to step out and to say, you know what? I need to tell you about a God who loves you. Because I want you to know something, folks. In the day and age in which we live right now, there is a battle being waged, and it is a spiritual battle. And it's going to be won by those who will be brave. And it's high time the Church of Jesus Christ stood up and said, you know what? There is one who gives hope and a future and purpose and a promise and real life. And it is found in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. And we offer that hope into our world. Now look, here's what's going to happen. By the end of this story, God's going to throw in an earthquake just for good measure. But that doesn't happen first. Because the faith step is first. We've got to do something. And not just do something, we've got to be willing to do something brave. All right then, Jonathan told him. Here's what we're going to do. Look what his plan is. He says, we'll cross over and let them see us. How many battle strategists already are going, ooh, not the best plan I've ever heard. If they say to us, stay where you are or we'll kill you, we'll stop and not go up to them. But if they say, come on up and fight, then we will go up. And that will be the Lord's sign that he will help us defeat them. God is stirring Jonathan's heart. And so he turns to his armor bearer and he says, I've got a plan. And after he says it to the armor bearer says, let me just review this and make sure I'm clear on the plan here. So we're going to go down into the valley that they control, and instead of sneaking over, we're going to make sure they see us. Am I right? Yep. And then, if they tell us they want us to come up, we're going to climb all the way up the cliff. I got that part? Yep. And when we get to the top of the cliff, the 20 of them who have seen us coming and have prepared themselves for us and aren't exhausted from a climb are going to meet the two of us. Is that the plan, Jonathan? Jonathan says, yep, you got it. The armor bearer says, if you really need confirmation from God, couldn't we go with something like, we'll go down in the valley, we'll let them see us, we'll call up to them, and when they lean over the edge to talk back, if they fall off the cliff and they're dying on the rocks, we'll finish them off. Wouldn't that be a better plan? Jonathan says, no, we're going to go be brave. The direction of this entire nation, of this globe, will be shaped by those brave enough to share the love of Jesus by whatever means possible. Doesn't something inside of you say, come on, let's take a chance on God? Come on, let's do something bigger than we yet picture. Let's just step out and take that first action. We sense that he's stirring our heart. We don't know everything that we're doing. We don't know all how it'll work out in the end, but we sense he's stirring our heart. So let's just go be brave and do it. Listen, I got to tell you the truth. Churches our size just don't launch other campuses this quick. But God stirred our heart and we said, help us be brave. Help us be brave when we give away our volunteers. Help us be brave when we start that new place. God, we don't know all that you're going to do, but just do what we don't know. I have some experience in that. Our first church that Diane and I took was in Laurel, Delaware. When we got there, I was 28. She was 27. We had 2 young children. One was already born, and one was, it looked to my wife about 11 months due. And we showed up at this church. Our opening Sunday, there were 63 people there. And of those 63 people, there were 2 couples young enough to have children. A few grandchildren smattered in. My church board, the average age of my church board was 70 years old. Now, there's nothing wrong with being 70 years old, and I need some 70-year-old people in this church, and I'm glad you are here. But you got to understand, this 28-year-old guy was looking at a board. I had to talk loud at my board meetings just to make sure most of them would hear me. So we started this church that looked nothing like us. This young couple with some young kids and a bunch of old folks in the room. But God began to stir our heart, and we began to believe that God was going to do something in our town. And so God began to bless, and we began to grow. One day, about a year and a half into this whole endeavor, I'm down in my office, which was kind of similar to a dungeon in that church. And there was a knock on the door, and I opened it, and there was a man standing there. I did not recognize him. He was holding in his hand a box that, when he would hold it here, it would go up higher than his head, and it was a toy soldier. He walked in and introduced himself. He said, you don't know me? My name's Jim Vanderhoven. I said, well, hello, Jim. Come on in. He said, are you Pastor Todd? I said, I am. He said, the reason I'm here, he says, I heard that God's beginning to do a work in your church. Now, let me stop here and tell you something. That in and of itself was a miracle of God. Because when we came and established that church, well, we didn't establish a church. It had been around 70 years. But when we came and began to establish the work we were doing in that church, on the first week when I went to the bank to open a bank account, she said, now, what church are you pastoring? And I said, the Wesleyan church. She said, oh, the Split Church. Our church was so famous for splitting and fighting. That's what we were known as in the community. I said, well, at least you know who we are. But Jim Vanderhoven came a year and a half later and said, I sense that God's doing something. This is what I hear he's doing. He said, so I've got these things. And I looked at this toy soldier, and he said, you don't know it. He said, underneath this awesome wrapping, he said, this toy soldier is made out of chocolate. He said, here's the thing. I've got 50 of these things. See, it turned out that Jim ran this Christian-based food bank that was just giving away food to anybody who needed it. And he had come upon these things at some sale somewhere, and they were from like Macy's or some big department store. 50 of these things. He says, you know what? I don't know what to do with them. He says, but if you have any ideas, you can have them. I said, we'll take them. I had no ideas. But we were a little church, and when people give you stuff for free, whatever it is, you take it. And so I took these 50 toy chocolate soldiers that he had. I took just one home that night, sat there on the counter, and Diane and I talked through the night. and said, God, help us, give us wisdom. And so we brainstormed the idea of having something we would call Kids Day. Now, our church didn't have very many kids, but we were going to have a Kids Day. And so we decided what we would do is we would call it the Chocolate Factory. And we would give away these chocolate toy soldiers to all the kids who came. But as we began to pray about it, we began to say, you know what, that vision is too small. 50 chocolate toy soldiers will not be enough because God's going to give us more than 50 kids. We're going to have to make it a drawing. When they come in, they'll put their name, and we'll draw 50 for the winners because God's going to give us 200 kids. So I went to my board, and I said, we got a Sunday coming up in about 3 or 4 months. We're going to do something really different. I'm not going to preach a regular sermon. I'm not going to wear a suit or a tie. We're not going to have the normal praise music that we have. Rather, we're going to have a service and call it the Chocolate Factory. 3 of my board members leaned over, turned their hearing aids up and said, say that again. They said, what kind of idea is this? I said, this is a crazy idea, but we're going to do it. Why are we going to do it? Because God gave us chocolate soldiers. And I said, we're going to have 200 children show up. And we're going to tell them all about Jesus. They're like, Pastor, 200 children. There's only like 100 of us total in the church. I said, I know. You better get to work. So we turned our sanctuary into a chocolate factory. My wife found these chocolate-scented candles, and we ordered them. We set them on all the windowsills and lit them overnight and let them burn all night long. And that's how we burned our first church down. No, we didn't. The whole room smelled like chocolate when those kids came in. People had volunteered to do all kinds of things. I had one lady in my church, she was in her 50s, and she came and she said, I want to do something, but I'm not sure what I can do. I said, okay, Joyce, you know what? Let's talk. What do you got? She says, you know, I used to do clowning years ago. I said, you're not one of those creepy clowns, are you? She said, no, I'll be a really happy clown. I said, all right, you can be a clown. That's the last thing I told her of what she could do. I said, you can be a clown. I figured she'd stand out back and smile and wave at kids and make balloon dogs. You know what she did? Without me clearing it? 30 seconds before the service started, she ran down the center aisle of our church, honking a horn, and did a cartwheel. When she landed, she almost bumped into the vice chairman of my board, and I looked down the aisle and went, I am so fired. Those kids started to come. And kept coming and kept coming. And we did this fun service with these crazy songs and all this stuff and the balloons and talked about chocolate and how Jesus is the sweetest thing in life and all. We're doing all this stuff. So I'm just getting ready to get up and give my little mini sermon to the kids, and someone comes up. Now, what I got to tell you is, to inspire our people, I had told them, if we get 200 kids, you can shave my head. I told them. Well, they came up and handed me a piece of paper, and it said 187 children. Thanks be to God. Folks, that's like the perfect number. We still reached all those kids, and I get to keep my hair. It's perfect. So I'm preaching along. I'm about 2/3 of the way done with this little 12-minute sermon. Don't worry, you're not getting one of those today. And I hear this scraping sound out in our parking lot. One of the ladies in our church who heard we had only made it to 187 got in her station wagon. It was one of those old wood-sided ones, you know? She went out into our community. I don't know where I think she went to the laundromat. I think she was probably knocking on doors, waking people up, and said, come on, you need to help us shave our pastor's head. I am not even kidding you. 17 children piled out of that station wagon. And they came up into the sanctuary, and they all come busting in near the end. They all sit down. And so I told my mother-in-law, nope, they're too late, they don't count. And she said, nope, whenever they get here, they count. And she still feels that way to this very day. And we went over 200 kids, 45 of which gave their heart to Jesus that day. So we went out into the parking lot afterwards, and we were cooking up hot dogs that the church couldn't afford, and it had a bounce house that someone had helped fund, and we're just out having a blast out there. And so eventually the hairdresser in the church, she came out, and I sat down, and she turned on the clippers, and she did on purpose what my wife started to do to me accidentally a few weeks ago. If you haven't seen the pictures, come see me. Shave my head. Gabriel, well, I don't know if Tori cried. She was a little young. Gabriel cried. Gabriel cried. Diane cried. So you say, Pastor Todd, we're launching a church this weekend. Are you going to let him shave your head? We didn't make numeric goals like that because I'm afraid if we shave it now, I'm not sure how much of it's ever coming back. We ought to shave Pastor Shane's head because he's been in the military. He's been through that already. Hey, they're clapping, Pastor Shane. But you know what? Crazy ideas that started with a bunch of chocolate toy soldiers. And you know what ended up happening? We did Kids Day every year, annually, after that. And along about the 4th or 5th year of doing that, we actually shut the entire center of town down so that 3,000 people could show up and hear about Jesus. You see, you never know what God's going to do. And this morning, as we step out and take a risk and jam a bunch of people into a room that's too small, as we begin to say, some weeks when you come to church, you're going to have to watch flat me on the screen instead of 3D me. Don't worry, my voice will still be every bit as deep and commanding as it is today. It's okay. Because we just think that God's calling us to do something brave, and here we go. So do something brave. But catch this, do something brave together. The armor bearer said, do what you think is best. I am with you completely, whatever you decide. Look at me, church. If someone will come alongside me and say, do what you think is best, Pastor Todd, I'm with you completely, there ain't nothing I'm scared to do. And when someone comes alongside you and you're ready to step out and to be brave for God and to go in that new direction, and someone comes alongside you and puts their arm around your shoulder and looks at you and says, you know what? Do what you think God's calling you to do. I'm with you. There's nothing we can't do. You hear me? I mean, think about it for a minute. Here's Jonathan's plan. Jonathan's plan is, I'm going to scale the side of a cliff, and when I get up there, I'm going to pull out my sword and start taking them out. What's the armor bearer's plan? You remember I told you, he ain't got no sword. The armor bearer's plan is, I'm going to scale the side of the cliff, and when I get up to the top, God help me, I'll do something. That's his plan. And so they do. In this crazy individualistic world in which we live, oh, that we would realize how God calls us to things together. How he calls us to take a risk, but he doesn't send us out alone. Even for those of you who are willing to take the risk today to say, you know what, I've listened to many sermons, but today is the day that I receive Christ into my life and I step into this new life. You don't step into it alone. God's going to bring all kinds of people in this church around you. Well, Pastor Todd, I'm kind of a Lone Ranger sort. Folks, I want you to know something. Even your whole idea of Lone Ranger is a fallacy because he wasn't alone. He had Tonto by his side. You see, John Maxwell said it this way: one is too small of a number to achieve greatness. We can accomplish so much more together. And this crazy idea that we can somehow impact Southern Maryland, we aren't going it alone there either. Here's the thing about being part of a team. Here's the thing about working along with someone. It makes every result better. You see, if you're with a team and you win, you get to celebrate. And if you're with a team and you get to lose, the result will be humility and correction to do better. But when you go it alone and you win the victories, it leads to pride. And when you go it alone and you lose, it leads to discouragement and depression. So here we are on launch weekend, and we're now 2 campuses. Maybe the day will come when I'm preaching a sermon and say, as of today, we're 3 campuses, or we're 4 campuses. Look me in the eye, because I want to tell you something. We are one church. We're one church. And if you don't understand that dynamic, you need to call Anna and book a lunch with me. Because you've got to get that to be on board with it. Come on, church. You've got to get that to be on board with it. You see, we are not in competition with the South Campus. And the South Campus is not in competition with us. And when they win a victory at South, it's your victory. And when we win victories in Mechanicsville, it's their victory. Because we are one church. Because we're doing something brave together. And we are stepping out and saying, we just dare to believe that as we go through this together, we've got each other's back and it's going to work out. I have to show you real quick and then we'll close how this whole Jonathan and his armor bearer thing worked. Indeed, as you know, they were called to climb up the cliffs, and they did. So when they got to the top of the cliffs, this is what happened, and it was read to you. It says that the enemies fell before Jonathan. That's a term for they were slain by Jonathan. Jonathan crested the cliff, grabbed his sword, and went after it. So Jonathan's going charge, and he's running full steam ahead, and he's hacking them down. The armor bearer, he's right behind him. So he's running right behind Jonathan. He doesn't have a weapon. Here's my theory. He didn't have a weapon till Jonathan killed the first guy. And then he had a weapon. Keep going, I'm with you. But then here's what the passage says. So they fall before Jonathan. And it says, the armor bearer killed all who came behind. In other words, Jonathan's running forward. The armor bearer, he's going like this. Got your back. Got your back. Jonathan's charging forward, and no one's able to sneak in from behind and take him out, because that's the armor bearer's job. Sometimes the glory goes to the guy who's charging forward, not to the one who's in the background protecting. But together, they win the battle. Now, I was trying to recall the armor bearer's name. Do you remember that guy's name? Let me think. There's a reason I can't think of it. And it's not the normal reason, which is I'm getting older. I can't think of it because the passage doesn't give us his name. We never know. But he doesn't care. Because here's the thing. The issue is not, as we do God's work together, whether or not you get the big part. The question is, are you ready to be a part of something big? Because someday, when it's all said and done, and God has impacted this entire area through the work of real life, and it's generations from now, some will think back and say, what was what's his name who got this going? And no one will be around to remember. And it won't matter. Because in the end, the glory belongs to God. Because at the end of this story, it says, on that day, God rescued Israel. I have to tell you, I had to think long and hard about that. Because what I really wanted to say or think was that it should have said, and at the end of that day, Jonathan and his armor bearer rescued Israel. No. All Jonathan and the armor bearer did was took the first step. They went into motion, and God turned it into a movement. See, here's what happened. They cut down 20 men. As they're doing it, as they're pushing those men aside, there's a watchman over there, and he's with Saul, and Saul doesn't even know that Jonathan, the armor bearer, had done this, and they say, something's going on over there. Look, the Philistines are being pushed back. So when they finally understand what's happening, look what they do. On the screen it says, then Saul and all his men rushed out to the battle and found the Philistines killing each other. There was terrible confusion everywhere. Even the Hebrews who had previously gone over to the Philistine army revolted and joined in with Saul and Jonathan and the rest of the Israelites. Likewise, the men of Israel who were hiding in the hill country of Ephraim joined the chase when they saw the Philistines running away. So the Lord saved Israel that day. At the very first verse that was read to you today, it said the Israelites were hiding in holes and in caves and under rocks. You know what happened? Jonathan and his armor bearer took a step, they went into motion, and God turned it into a movement. And everybody else jumped in and went for it. What if God is calling you in this area of your life to be the person that goes into motion and there's a movement coming behind you? Because I want you to know something. Every great move of God begins simply with someone who took an action to be obedient to God. They never said from day one, I'm going to make a movement. They just said, God's calling me out, and I am going to do it. What brave thing is God calling you to do? To finally speak up for him? To finally share your testimony? To finally volunteer so you impact the lives of children or adults or hungry people? What's he calling you to do? To stand up against the things that have been defeating you? You see, to thrive, there's got to be an R. The R is risk. He's calling you out to be brave.